Okay, so we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and we left off at verse 15. Like I said, we're going to see if this will work to let me write on it. And some of our folks that are online can let me know if how that shows up. And looks like I got stray marks on here. So let me see. Yeah, there we go. But there's a lot of capability with this. It's just some of it is learning to use it and getting it to work just right. But I discovered I can even do a pointer here, and I can highlight. And even when you have a really unsteady hand like I do, and you do a very crooked highlight, it just straightens it right out for you. So that's our verse where we left off, verse 15. Paul's been dealing with marriage. As I mentioned in chapter 7, he picks up talking about, he's going to be answering some questions that they have. And by the way, I guess because the stylus, pencil capabilities, or the technology is still, I guess, new enough that there's not really a good Bible app where you can just draw on your text or write notes on your text within the app. So I found I guess like a blog, and that guy gave kind of a workaround, and you can download the King James Version. It's totally out of copyright. It's completely free. You can just download it as a PDF and import it into this app. It's called Good Notes, and I can write all over it, save it that way, or discard all my changes and start over each week, however I want to do that. So it's actually not a bad workaround at all, really. So anyway, Paul's dealing with their questions, answering questions pertaining to marriage. It seems that some of them had asked, okay, so I've become a Christian. My spouse is not a Christian. Do I need to leave them since they're not a Christian? If they won't convert, do I need to leave them? And of course, Paul's answer is unequivocally no. That's not wrong. And by the way, when we get over into 2 Corinthians, Paul's going to talk about be not unequally yoked together with believers. And sometimes brethren will teach, that's saying that it's a sin to marry someone who is not a Christian. Now, I will say, I teach my children. I teach whenever I have the opportunity to teach or preach. Is it wise? No. You want to marry somebody who's going to help you to go to heaven. But is it a sin? It's not, in that situation, in that sense, sinful. If it were, well, what's the answer to that? You'd have to separate, right? Divorce. And that's not what God wants. And in my class that I taught for OABS, one of the questions I asked on the 2 Corinthians final was, as kind of a discussion question, to discuss that passage in 2 Corinthians 6 about being unequally yoked together with believers. Does it mean that it's a sin for a Christian to marry a non-Christian? And if you believe that, or if you believe that that's not what it's saying, explain your answer. And one brother, and I put a note on his test. I said, man, it's an excellent point. He referenced back to 1 Corinthians 7, and he said that shows. Paul says, if you're married and you become a Christian and your spouse is not a Christian, you stay married, and you don't just separate just because of that. And so that's kind of some of what he's dealing with here. He deals with several different things, but he says in verse 15, again, backing up just a little bit, he's said a couple of different times. Some of this Jesus dealt with when he was on the earth. Where is that verse? 10, unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. Let not the wife depart from her husband. Jesus addressed that, Matthew 5, also Matthew 19. But and if she depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. Let not the husband put away his wife, but to the rest speak I, not the Lord. He's not saying this claiming inspiration. He's saying Jesus didn't address this while on earth. So here's what inspired teaching is on it. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. And the woman which hath an husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. And so he says, the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband, verse 14. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. The union, the marriage, is recognized by God. It's wholly recognized by God. It's recognized as a scriptural marriage as long as they marry scripturally. And so those children are legitimate. If it were not a God-recognized marriage, the children wouldn't be legitimate. Not, as we pointed out last week, he's not saying that the unbelieving husband or the unbelieving wife, the unbelieving spouse, is somehow made righteous or saved by a believing spouse, but he's saying it is, in fact, a God-recognized marriage. Yes, ma'am? If they're content to stay. And that's what he deals with in verse 15. So he says, and that's a good question, because when you get to verse 15, he says, but if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. And of course, the reverse would be true. If the unbelieving depart, let her depart, depending on the situation. And so he says, a brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. And the key word here is this word. I'm still on highlighter. The key word here is the word bondage. It's a word in the Greek. I'm going to have to look at my notes to make sure I tell you right. It's dedulatai is how it's translated. And y'all have to bear with me because I'm still learning to write with this thing. Dedulatai. Yeah, that's real clear, isn't it? You had to bear with my chicken scratch. I'm hopefully it'll get easier to do as you learn to use the thing. But it's a word that is the root word. We'll just say it's from doulos. Is that clear? A little bit. It's from the word doulos. Maybe you've heard that word before. Doulos is used numerous times in Scripture, and it means servant or bondservant. We would say it more in our culture, how we recognize that term, it's more like slave. This is someone who, you recall in the Old Testament, in fact, we sometimes sing a song, Pierce My Ear, and that's taken from an Old Testament text. It's in Deuteronomy, and the chapter slipped my mind. But talks about there, if you have a servant, and there was a law in the law of Moses where servants were allowed to go free in the year of Jubilee and things like that. But he says there may be a situation where you have a servant who is pleased to dwell with his master. And he says, I don't want to leave. I like my master. He's good to me. He takes care of me. I want to stay. You go to the door, you pierce his ear, and that was a show to all that he has chosen. And it's kind of a picture of Christianity. We choose to be the Lord's servant. He doesn't force us to serve him. He calls us through the gospel, 2 Thessalonians 2:14. But if I choose to follow him, to serve him, then, and of course that's the idea in the psalm, pierce my ear, O Lord my God, take me to your door this day. I will serve no other God. Lord, I'm here to stay. And that's that idea. But this word doulos, it means bondservant or slave. Sometimes people will read this, and honestly, you can look at this text and you can see where, at first glance, somebody might get the idea that, well, he says, if you have an unbelieving spouse and they depart, well, okay, you're free. And a lot of people teach it that way, and that's why I wanted to come back to this verse and spend a little bit of time on it, because Sometimes people will use the expression, the Pauline exception. And they'll say, Jesus in Matthew 19 gives one exception for remarriage after a divorce, and that being the innocent party who puts away his or her spouse for that spouse's fornication. They're then free to remarry. And then a lot of times people will say, but there is another exception given in Scripture, and it's in 1 Corinthians 7:15. I will go ahead and tell you that's not the case, and it cannot be the case. Number one, there are a number of different reasons. Number one, Paul, you can look at this section and this context, and even backing up a little bit, and you can see nowhere in this context does he talk about remarriage. It's not even under consideration. That's number one. We've kind of, people sometimes run to this passage and want to talk about remarriage, and it's like, that's not even what he's talking about here. What he's talking about is, what do you do if your spouse is not a Christian and you are? And he does also deal with, well, what if your spouse decides not being a Christian and you are a Christian, and your spouse says, well, you know what, if you're going to be a Christian, I'm out of here. Because they're not a believer, they're not convinced. Okay, Paul, what do we do in that situation? He says, well, if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. And somebody says, but Chad, it says you're not under bondage. You're not enslaved in that situation. But this word, this chicken scratch word of mine here, Dollahite, that word is in the, I thought I had it written in my notes. Anyways, it's the grammatical force of it is, I think it's present, active, maybe indicative. But here's what it literally means. A brother or sister is not now, nor have they ever been under bondage in such cases. You are not now under bondage, nor have you ever been under bondage in such a case. That eliminates this being a reference to the bond of marriage. I will also mention this word doulos, the doulahite being taken from that, the root word is doulos. It is used, some form of this word is used over 130 times in the New Testament. Now, it's used in various ways. Paul sometimes would say, I'm a slave of Christ. And that's a metaphorical use. He's saying, I'm the Lord's servant. Sometimes it's used for a literal slave. But 130 plus times, I've got in my notes from preaching school 133 times. I found, I think, 134. I've heard other people say 135, so we'll just say over 130 times. And not once in all of those 130 plus usages is it ever referring to the marriage bond, unless it happens to be right here in 1 Corinthians 7. That would be strange indeed if 130 plus uses in the New Testament and you have only the one here referencing the marriage bond. But again, it cannot be, because it's saying you're not now, nor have you ever been under bondage. If that were talking about the marriage bond, well, at some point you were not under that bond because you were single. And then if you're married, that knot is tied, we sometimes use that terminology today, then you are under bondage, if it were the marriage bond. But he says you're not now, nor have you ever been under bondage. So, Chad, what is he talking about here? What he's saying is, if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. You are not a slave to that individual. You are a slave to Jesus Christ. Right. And he doesn't want it to stay that way, But what he's saying is, if it comes down to a spouse that says, you know what, honey? You're on this kick with serving Jesus and following the Lord. And if you're going to continue with that, you're going to have to make a choice. It's either me or the Lord, me or the church. He says, well, your choice was made the day you were baptized into Christ because you made a commitment to the Lord. The principle here is Matthew 10:37, where Jesus says, he that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he that taketh not his cross and followeth after me is not worthy of me. That goes on into verse 38. That is the principle that he's teaching. He's not just saying, well, you know, if the unbeliever departs, so just be like, good. Now I'm freed up. But he's also not saying if the unbeliever departs, just say, well, oh, well, I guess I'll have to go find me another mate. He's not even dealing with remarriage. He just says if there's an ultimatum there where you've got to choose between a spouse and the Lord, you've already made that choice when you became a Christian. No one comes before God. Go ahead, Tim. Yeah, and that's a good point because, yeah, he makes it very clear in Ephesians 5, husband's the head of the wife. But if the husband were to say, you stop being a Christian, he says, you are not now, nor have you ever been under bondage to obey somebody contrary to the will of God. And that's a very good point because, as the psalmist says, the sum of thy word is truth. You have to take everything God says on a subject to come up with the Bible teaching. And so, again, he cannot be talking here about the marriage relationship because the force of the verb there, the force of the usage, not now, never has been under bondage. He says God has called us to peace. And when you continue in the text, you see again why it's not talking about that because verse 16 in particular, he says, what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? Well, if he's saying, if they depart, you're free to go. And you can go be remarried to somebody else. Well, how on earth does that help to save your spouse? It doesn't. If anything, you've just sent them further into the world. Because now you've just said, well, you're on your own. What he's saying is, everybody has a moral obligation to save their marriage. And again, that's the whole context here of 1 Corinthians 7. They're saying, well, what do we do? You know, again, we're 2,000 years removed, and so it's perhaps, you know, a little more difficult for us to understand. It's certainly not impossible. But in our culture, we have to look through first century glasses. I don't know who first coined that phrase, but it's a good phrase. Study texts through first century glasses. The church is still relatively new. The church in Corinth is still a young congregation. So they're dealing with issues that, okay, well, Jesus Some of this he dealt with, Matthew 19, Matthew 5. But what about a situation where, okay, we're married, but now I've obeyed the gospel. My spouse is not interested right now. I hope he'll come around, but as of right now, he's not interested. Do I need to just up and leave him? Paul says no. What if he gives me an ultimatum, Paul? Let him go. You're the servant of the Lord, not your spouse. However, by taking a stand now, who knows? You might end up helping to bring about the salvation of your spouse. Can you imagine if your spouse says, look, you're going to choose me or the Lord? I mean, this Jesus stuff, talking about the church, and you're leaving me on Sunday mornings to go worship with the church. I ain't putting up with that. You got to make a choice. And you say, okay, well, I guess I'll just quit and I'll stay home with you. Well, is that going to help bring about the salvation of a spouse? It's not. But if you take a stand, you say, well, honey, I'm sorry. I'm committed to our marriage, and I'm going to do everything in my power to make it work. But Jesus comes first because he is Lord. And I am first and foremost the bondservant of Jesus Christ. That commitment, in fact, even in more modern times, there are so many examples that could be given of people who have made that stand, and they ended up helping to bring about the salvation of their spouse. I know I heard a situation several years ago. It was one of those that the brother that told it, I said, is that for real? And he said, it is absolutely 100% true. A lady that her husband was so militantly against the church that he took the keys and he I don't remember if he locked them up or hid them so she couldn't go to church. And I don't remember if he was a farmer or if he just had a tractor. She actually got up and she got on the tractor. They didn't live terribly far away from the church building. She got on the tractor and went to Bible study and worship. It infuriated him. He took the keys to the tractor. She got up earlier the next Sunday and walked to services. And it at first it made him so angry, and she was very calm and said, honey, I'm doing this because it's right. I'm not just trying to buck my husband and to rebel, but it's the right thing. And eventually it got his attention so much that he thought, I'm going to go down there and see what is the big deal, that she's willing to just go to these lengths. And he even began to study the Bible. What's so special about the Bible? Let me just see. And the man ended up becoming a Christian. Numerous examples of that throughout history. But by taking that stand, you can help to bring about the salvation of your spouse. Peter's going to deal with this also in 1 Peter 3. They might, without a word, be won by the conversation or the behavior of the wife. So that also comes into play. Robert, you're going to say something. 1 Peter 3? Oh, okay. Yeah, but that's what he's talking about. Yeah. He says, sometimes talking to them, you can talk to them till you're blue in the face, but when they see it in action, and so if you capitulate and say, well, okay, I'll just stay home because this is the ultimatum you've given me, what good does that do? But you take a stand for the Lord, may very well be that you can bring about your spouse's obedience to the gospel. Were you about to say something, Tim? I think it went from your mind to Robert to mine. Okay. Yeah, that's 1 Peter 3 comes right into play. The question is, what about when dating? And I think it'd be a similar principle. It's not obviously that's not as difficult because you don't have, the boyfriend is not head over the girlfriend, but the husband is head over the wife. And so it's a little bit different circumstance. But yeah, I mean, but it kind of does help in dealing with that situation and how to handle it. But so many times, and I have said before, whether it's a woman with a husband who is an unbeliever or a man with a wife who is an unbeliever, one of the best things you can do to help facilitate, it doesn't always work because individuals have to make choices and they have free will. But one of the best things that you can do to help facilitate them coming around is live it. And let them see it's made a difference in your life. One of the greatest hindrances to evangelism, period. I don't care if we're talking about spouses or just individual members, period. One of the greatest hindrances is when people look at us and we look just like the world. And they think, I don't want to be a Christian. You're just like everybody else. You get on Facebook and you're mean and you're hateful and you're always ranting and raving about something. You look miserable. You act miserable. What's the big deal? But if they see something is different and they see it's wrought a change in us, now that makes a difference. And so it's one of the best things we can do for anybody, but especially for spouses, let them see that it's first in my life and it's made a difference in my life for the good. And so he says, you may be able to save your spouse by taking that stand. And again, that shows he's not dealing with just going out and marrying somebody else. He's saying, hang in there because you might just bring about the salvation of your spouse by taking a stand for what is right. And so he says, verse 17, as God hath distributed to every man, as the Lord hath called every one, so let him walk, and so ordain I in all churches. The general thought here is, again, I mentioned this, every person has a moral obligation to try to save their marriage. Obeying the gospel doesn't change this. And so the condensed version of what Paul is saying here is, stay with your spouse. Don't leave just because you've become a Christian and your spouse is not. And if they get to the point where they say, you're going to have to make a choice, me or the Lord, then you've already chosen. You obey the gospel, you choose the Lord. But try to save your marriage. Try to save your spouse, because that's the most important. I mean, that's the closest relationship on earth is the marriage relationship. And so I want to be doing everything I can to save my spouse. So in line with that, he says, verses 18 and 19, is any man called being circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Is any called in uncircumcision? Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing but the keeping of the commandments of God. Now there's some background here for this statement from what we sometimes call the anti-Paul faction, those Judaizers who would say, well, and again, some of the background for this is in Acts 15. You had people, Judaizers, that were saying, well, unless you become circumcised, you can't be right with God. And Paul over and over again in several different epistles says, doesn't matter one bit. And so same thing here. If you're called in circumcision, don't worry about it. If you're called in uncircumcision, called there being a metaphorical statement for you. If you obeyed the gospel, being a Jew, okay, you don't need to become uncircumcised. If you obeyed the gospel, being a Greek, you don't need to become circumcised. That's nothing. That doesn't matter. But keeping God's commandments, that is the key here. And years ago, there was a guy on one of these email lists I was on, a gospel preacher, and the guy was pretty balanced on a lot of different things, but this was kind of his hobby horse, was 1 Corinthians 7, and he would talk about doctrines of demons, referencing Paul's statement in 1 Timothy 4, verse 2. He says, this traditional view on marriage and divorce and remarriage is a doctrine of demons, and he would go here to 1 Corinthians 7, 15 and following, and he'd say, this shows you're free to remarry if your spouse, up and leaves you. And he would ignore the context, talking about a spouse who's basically leaving because there's an ultimatum there, me or the Lord. But he would also hammer these verses, 18 and 19. Oh, look, every man abide, if you drop down to verse 20, let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. If you're in a marriage and somebody tells you, oh, you're in an unscriptural marriage, but you become a Christian, you just abide in that calling. Here's the problem with that, folks. Just abide in the calling wherewith you're called. What if, and this is a very real situation in our culture, because our Supreme Court, as if they were the Supreme Court of the universe, has decided that it's legal if two men or two women want to get married. So suppose you get caught up in that And here are two men that they have, as the law would say, become married. And along the way, somehow or another, they come into contact with the gospel. And they obey the gospel. Or even, let's just say, one of them obeys the gospel. And he goes and he reads 1 Corinthians 7:20, and he says, well, let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. Well, nobody has a right to tell me to get out of this marriage because I'm just abiding in the calling wherewith I was called. It's not going to work, is it? You can't abide in a sinful calling, in a sinful state. And so if the marriage is unscriptural in any way, shape, form, or fashion, I can't just abide in that. And what he's talking about here is, and go on into verse 21, art thou called being a servant? Care not for it. But if thou mayest be made free, use it rather. For he that is called in the Lord being a servant, a bondservant, and there's our word, or at least some form of that word doulos, he that is called in the Lord being a servant is the Lord's freeman. Likewise also he that is called being free is Christ's servant. You're bought with a price, be not ye the servants of men. That goes back to verse 15. If the unbeliever depart, let him depart. You're not under bondage. Now, not now, nor ever have you been in that kind of bondage. You're not the servants of men. He repeats verse 20 and there in 24, brethren, let every man wherein he's called, therein abide with God. You got to abide in that calling with God. If you're not with God, scriptural in that calling, you can't just abide in that. Somebody may go and rob a bank and then later on become a Christian, and maybe they've somehow gotten away with it. And so they say, well, I got all this money, but I'm just going to abide in the calling wherewith I was called. You can't just keep stolen goods. That's part of repentance. Restitution where possible. So understand what he's talking about here. And this is why I'm very, very careful when it comes to getting involved in political stuff. Now, morality those are biblical matters. But how we handle it is crucial. Because what he is saying here is, you're not called to a social revolution. Do you obey the gospel being a slave to someone? If you happen to obey the gospel and you're a slave, I need to give my full time and energy to becoming a free man because God's not okay with slavery. He says, we're not called to a social revolution. Now, if you can be made free, sure, use it. But that's not your big concern. If you're free and you obey the gospel, understand that at the end of the day, you're Jesus' bond slave. Don't be the servants of men. This is all about being a bond slave, a servant of Jesus Christ. Tim, I think you were going to say something just a second ago. Sorry about that. So he says, you're not called to a social revolution. And that's kind of a big idea here in this section. Sometimes we talk about the social gospel. The social gospel wants to change everything in society. But here's the deal. If we live the gospel and we teach it, we can change the world. And sometimes we're changing it one person at a time, but the best way to do that is not there was a big discussion on the Memphis School of Preaching alumni list just this past week about, this month is so-called Pride Month. There are a lot of parades and marches and things like that. And so this guy, and I know the guy well enough from just seeing his other posts, I think his heart's in the right place, but he was just trying to think of some way to sort of take a stand or try to counter that without being too egregious and confrontational. And he thought, well, what if we did something like, he says, I don't want to call it a march. I don't want to call it a parade because that sounds kind of in your face. Maybe just a walk, a humility walk, because, the opposite of humility is pride. And, after a lot of back and forth discussion, he decided, he says, I don't know if that's the best idea. But one of the guys commenting on that made, I think, a spot-on observation. He said, if we want to change the culture, he says, something like that is probably going to come across as doing the same thing as a pride parade or a pride march, except, you're over here on the believers' side, and people are going to, but people on the other end of the spectrum are going to see that and think, oh, you're just trying to, rub it in our face or try to, whatever. So what one guy said was, if we want to change our society, if we want to change the world, one of the best things we can do is, whether it's social media or our interpersonal interactions, is live like Christians, behave like Christians, speak like Christians. And that will make a difference. He said a lot of times they see us on social media, at work, at school, in our interactions, in our families, and we look just like the world. And so people tend to say, what do you have to offer that I don't already have? What do you want me to just change over and be just like you, but continue to act basically the same way? And so you can see where that has a counterproductive effect. And that's what he's saying here. You're not called to some kind of social revolution. You're called to serve the Lord. And that gets to one of the points in our sermon this morning, that Christians are not better people. Better off, certainly. But Christians are not better people inherently. They're better because they are living for Jesus. And when we live our lives for Jesus, that's the best life. Jesus says, I came that they might have life and that they might have it more abundantly. When you get into verses 25 through pretty much the end of the chapter here, he's going to deal with, he says, now concerning virgins. They had a question about that, or at least he's going to anticipate a question about that perhaps. And he says, I have no commandment of the Lord. Again, not disclaiming inspiration, but he's saying Jesus didn't deal with this. Well, what in this situation, and by the way, I'll go ahead and use my handy highlighter here. Remember, it's so nice to have that because I can't highlight straight to save my life. That's our key verse, right? Verse 26. And so he says, I don't have a commandment from the Lord. Jesus didn't teach about this while on earth, but I give my judgment as one that hath obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful. These are the commandments of the Lord, 1 Corinthians 14:37. For the present distress, what he's talking about here in the context is, when he's talking about the virgins, he's talking about, here's a man, he has a daughter. She's of marriageable age. Well, what do I need to do? Should I just not allow her to marry? Should I just forbid her to marry? And so he says, first of all, if you're bound to a wife, seek not to be loosed. Or if you're loosed from a wife, seek not a wife. But and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. Now sometimes people, goes back to what Tim said earlier, without taking all of Scripture, sometimes I've seen people, in fact, this guy that I mentioned before, he jumped to this verse and he says, look, if you marry, you haven't sinned. Well, folks, does that just negate everything else? Can we just ignore everything else said in Scripture about marriage? What he's saying there is, if thou marry, scripturally, you haven't sinned. It doesn't mean you can just go and enter into, for example, a homosexual marriage, so-called, or an unscriptural marriage that goes against the teaching of God. But if you marry scripturally, you haven't sinned. And if a virgin marries, she's not sinned. He's saying to those fathers, those dads, if you give your daughter in marriage, you haven't sinned. Nevertheless, there in verse 28, such shall have trouble in the flesh, but I spare you. Literally, we could say, I would spare you. And that's what he's saying here as far as key in this little section. He's saying you're going to have more problems. Whatever this present distress is, and we're not told, again, I think probably most likely some kind of persecution. But he does say here, the time is short. In other words, whatever this persecution is, it's not going to be a big, long, drawn-out thing. It's a short time. But he says, while it remaineth, that both they that have wives be as though they had none, and they that weep as though they wept not, and they that rejoice as though they rejoice not, and they that buy as though they possess not. This is all centering around that present distress. And they that use this world as not abusing it, And so he says, for the fashion of this world passeth away. These things of the world are transient. In other words, Paul says, don't think I'm trying to just really box you in and make your life miserable by saying you're better off in this present distress not to marry. I'm not trying to keep you from something good, but understand that in the grand scheme of things in eternity, you're not going to be better off if you married, or worse off if you didn't. You're not going to be better off necessarily if you didn't marry, worse off if you did. He's saying in this present distress, however, you are better off not having been married. And that, simply put, is the bottom line. That's what he's getting at. And so he says there, verse 32, I would have you without carefulness. Now, we use that word differently in our, in our time. We say, be careful, exercise caution. Well, what he's saying here is typically how the King James uses that word is more like anxiety. Philippians 4:6, be careful for nothing. He's not saying don't ever be careful, throw caution to the wind. He's saying don't be anxious. And so Paul says, I would have you to be without anxiety. He that is unmarried careth for the things that belong to the Lord, how he may please the Lord. That's why he wants you focused. It's easier to focus your attention in this present distress, whatever that is. You're more focused on the Lord being single. He that is married careth for the things that are of the world, how he may please his wife. And he goes on and says, there's a difference also between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman careth for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she that is married careth for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. Again, he says, I speak for your own profit, not that I may cast a snare upon you, that you can attend upon the Lord without distraction. Without distraction, because this present distress, that's going to be more difficult to do. Now, true or false, can an unmarried person get caught up and choked out, as Jesus uses that illustration in Matthew 13, with the cares of this world? They absolutely can, can't they? So he's not saying it's inherently better in all circumstances to be single. Some people have taken it that way. Remember, one of the qualifications for an elder is to be married. He's saying in this present distress, you're better off that way. But if you think that you're not behaving yourself right, you can give your daughter, your virgin daughter, in marriage. But the one that stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, power over his own will, so decreed his heart that he'll keep his virgin, doeth well. He that giveth her in marriage doeth well, but he says, he that giveth her not in marriage does better. The wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth. That's Romans 7:1-3. That's the law of marriage. But if her husband's dead, she's at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. And we'll talk about that phrase, Lord willing, next week. But he says, she is happier if she so abide. You're better off in this present distress being single. After my judgment, he says, and I think also that I have the Spirit of God. He's not saying I think I do, but I'm not sure. He's saying, folks, trust me here. I'm trying to do and tell you what is best for you in this present distress. We'll move into chapter 8, Lord willing, next week, but I do want to come back to that phrase here, only in the Lord, because people sometimes have questions about that as far as a widow marrying after the death of a spouse. Thank y'all very much. We will, y'all let me know how, if this is helpful, what you think about it, and we'll see what we can do with it going forward. I appreciate the guys in the booth helping me out too.